All right, chapter 34, page 262. We climbed a steep embankment to an elevated walkway that overlooked the sea and the boats in the harbor. The walkway was crowded with pedestrians, and the boulevard that ran alongside it was wider than any four streets I had ever seen. We crossed the boulevard and were moving with a crowd of 100 or more up a cobbled street, and the center of which was congested with carts and motor cars and horses and wagons, and more people than we had ever seen in one place, speaking every language, it seemed, but our own. On either side were vendors and merchants of gold and silk and copper and spice, of tobacco and grain and silver and leather, mules burdened with blankets, and strolling peddlers calling out their wares. "Come here! You boy! Come here! Come here!" Above the street stood the gray stained fronts of countless buildings whose tile roofs blocked the sun, and everywhere the smell of meat and bread mingled with the faint smell of the sea. We were walking as quickly and as purposefully as our fellow pedestrians, and I felt, with Gagic beside me, like an army of two that had lost all the battles and still won the war. I walked with my family inside me, and with their smiles on my lips, their relief in my heart, and I looked about myself at this new world with the eyes of the boy I had been and the man I felt myself to be. We were nearing the top of the street when I stopped. Two men standing under the awning of a bookstore were speaking Armenian. It had been 3 years since I'd seen Armenians talking in the open, unafraid. Gagin and I listened for a moment, and one of the men looked at us, at our beggars' clothing and unwashed faces. "What is it?" he said, assuming, I suppose, that we were going to ask him for money. I told the man who I was and where I came from. I told him that my friend and I knew no one in Constantinople, and that we had no place to stay and needed help. "Could you please help us?" I said. "You said your name is Kandarian?" "Yes." "What is your father's name?" "Sarkis." "Your father is Sarkis Kandarian?" "Yes," I said. "I come from Bitlis myself. My name is Aram Nalbandian. What are you doing in Constantinople?" I told him, and his face changed, and he began to shake his head. "Your family is dead too," he said to Gagic, and Gagic nodded. The man shook his head and said a curse word quietly to himself. "Come with me," he said. That was all he said, but looking back at the speed with which the following events occurred, those 3 words proved to be as magical an incantation as open sesame. At that moment, time seemed to hand Gagic and me to our destiny, and the ground beneath our feet became a river carrying us to our new life. In a moment, we were standing before a 3-story brick building that said Hamanak. On one of the windows was printed the leading Armenian newspaper in Constantinople. Somewhere on that same window there should have been a sign that said "Gateway to the 20th Century." For when we stepped into the building, we also stepped into a new world of switchboards, ringing telephones, chattering typewriters, and working women, some of whom were smoking cigarettes and many of whom wore lipstick. We were led past countless rows of desks, though through a low swinging door to the office of a Mr. Havian. Mr. Havian took us to the office of Mr. Cherence. Mr. Cherence listened to our stories and asked us if we were hungry. We were. Mr. Cherence pushed a button on a black box and told the box to go to a certain restaurant and order every other item on the menu. The box was silent. Mr. Cherence turned to Gagic and me. "Do you boys want dessert?" We did. "And dessert," Mr. Cherence said to the black box. Y'all know what the black box is, right? Yeah. "Yes, sir," the box said, and an hour later the trays of hot and cold food began to arrive, until every desk, table, and chair in the room held at least one tray. Gagic and I ate until our stomachs were tight, and then we ate a little more. And the river swept on. In a matter of minutes, we were in the backseat of an automobile taking us to St. Gregory's Orphanage. We were shaking hands with Mr. Nazarian, the director of the orphanage. We bathed and were given clean uniforms to wear, clean socks and underwear and new shoes. We were given a room with our own beds and pillows. And then we were saying goodbye to Mr. Nalbandinian and Mr. Cherence. We were shaking their hands and thanking them for all they had done, for everything. And then the current of the river began to slow, and that night, when we finally got into our beds and lay our heads on our new pillows, it handed us back to time and disappeared beneath us. Chapter 35, page 267. The war ended. Turkey and Germany had been defeated. News reports. The triumvirate of Turkish leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Bey, and Jamal Pasha, have fled the country. Enver Pasha and Talat Bey are said to be in Berlin, reportedly with large sums of money expropriated from their Armenian victims. 80,000 Armenians were slain in Dagor, Arabia alone. In the same region, 7,000 children between the ages of 3 and 10 years old died of starvation. The Turkish parliament is dissolved. A newly formed government has decided to create a general court-martial for all functionaries responsible for the massacre of Armenians. My name is Von Kandarian. In 1918, I was 15 years old, the oldest boy at St. Gregory's Orphanage in Constantinople. 3 years before, I had been a member of one of the richest and most influential families in Turkey. I had been a reflection of a safe and privileged world, and beneath me was a net as wide as my father's influence, as strong as my mother's love. Now I was only one of 250 orphans, and my future was nothing more than a white canvas, a block of marble, a lump of clay. I had lost 3 years of schooling, and I was determined to learn as much as I could. The more I learned, I reasoned, the more I could become for myself and my family. Every morning I awakened in a bed beside 4 other beds, and it was the steel inside me that made it possible for me to get out of that bed and pretend I was myself. It was the steel that helped me study when all the other boys had gone to sleep. Do y'all remember the mention of the steel in book 1? Do y'all remember what they said about steel? How does steel get stronger? It's on the study guide. How does steel get stronger? By fire. So if you heat up steel, it gets even stronger. It doesn't melt it. And he's saying that through all the hardships that he's undergone, that he's become a stronger person. So he's comparing himself now to steel. What do y'all call that? Do y'all know what kind of literary device that is? Von is to being a stronger person as steel is to fire. An analogy. Okay? In 4 months, I completed the entire curriculum for the year. News reports. Turkish trials began in Constantinople. Kemal Bey, the governor of Diyarbakir, is the first to be tried for his participation in the Armenian massacres in the Yazdad district. Rishad Bey, the former governor of Diyarbakir and one of the enforcers of the Armenian butcheries, kills himself when he is caught by police. Colonel Bey, the governor of Diyarbakir, is found guilty of crimes against the Armenians and publicly hanged in Bayezid Square in Istanbul. Throughout Asia Minor, Armenians are still being persecuted by the Turks. The fact that the armistice has been signed seems to make no difference. On the recommendation of Father Ohanian, who later joined a committee to reunite Armenian families separated by the Holocaust, I was admitted to St. Mesrop schools for boys. Every day I took a streetcar to my new school, and every night I returned to the orphanage. When I closed my eyes at night, I felt a hollowness inside me that nothing could fill. Somewhere inside me, I knew that my grandmother still lay by the bank of the river Tigris, that the bones of my father still lay on the road to Diyarbakir. I knew that the home I had lost represented a million other homes, and the city I had lost represented the nation of what had once been Armenia. I knew that there would never be another Bitlis or Erzurum or Van, that the world I had known would survive only in the seed I carried within me, and that the memories of that seed would fade as one generation succeeded another. I knew that I was free and that I would never be free. One night I dreamed about my mother. We were standing on opposite banks of a river. I called to her, but she could not hear me above the sound of the water. I waved her toward me, but she shook her head. She could not come. News report. The British government, which was arrested and detained many young Turk officials on the island of Malta, has been persuaded to release the perpetrators of genocide in exchange for British soldiers captured by Turkish nationalist forces. Talat Bey is assassinated in a Berlin suburb by an Armenian student. Djal Pasha is assassinated in Tiflis by 2 Armenians. Enver Pasha, the last of the young Turk triumvirate responsible for the genocide, is killed in Turkestan fighting in the Bashmachi revolt against Russia. Estimates reveal that nearly 3/4 of the Armenian population of Turkey, that's 1,500,000 men, women, and children, has perished. Once a week, I took a streetcar to the Armenian cemetery 4 miles from St. Gregory's Orphanage. I felt at home among those graves as though I were standing in the center of my own heart, within the gated perimeter of a longing that would never age, never end, never grow wise. Here was Sisak and my mother and father, my grandmother in Diron and Tavel, Seta and Armenohi and Oskina. These were their graves, and I spoke to them soundlessly from the deepest part of myself. I planted flowers beside their graves, and I picked the weeds that grew beneath the flowers and felt the air weighted by a sublime and compassionate presence. I have learned this about life. I know, as my neighbors in Bitlis tried to tell me, that there is pain and disillusion in the heart of it. I know, as my father knew, that character and discipline are the steel that fortify it, and that somewhere beyond pain and disillusion, great blessings are made. And then if you turn on page 272, I'll give you guys an opportunity to read the epilogue, and we're done.